Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. In the past couple of months, we've witnessed the extraordinary spectacle of the president of the most powerful state in the world basically dismantling its institutions and, in a certain sense, reducing its international reach and power, making it less possible for the US government to do things domestically and abroad. It's really quite amazing. And as someone who studies the millennium and a half history of the Roman Empire, I always keep wondering, is there any Roman emperor who ever does something like this, like literally target his own government institutions for whatever reason? And I was starting to think about the actual reasons, and it seems here that we're dealing with a president who has an adversarial relationship with institutions of governance, in part because during his first term they had kind of served to block his agenda, and he was surrounded by officials who sort of slow-walked him, and it seemed that he was always sort of frustrated because he couldn't get the institutions to do what he wanted. And this, to me, as a Greek, and we'll get into this, raises the specter of the deep state, which is actually part of the problem here. And we'll be talking about that concept too. And I was just wondering if I could find someone with whom to have this conversation, lopsided and asymmetrical though it will be. As you will hear, these concepts don't always correspond to each other, but they have some very, very interesting structural similarities. And so I spent all this time looking on the internet. Now, when you when you Google conspiracy theories in the deep state on the internet, you're not exactly going to turn up scholars who work on those things. You're going to get rather a whole bunch of specimens of them. Anyways, I worked through all of this and I found people who were either part of the problem, so they'd written books and I tracked them down and it turns out they were peddling a conspiracy theory of their own, or I found some very distinguished theorists and people whom I wasn't going to trouble for, a conversation like this, which is more like for fun, but also just kind of like getting two fields to talk to each other, which I want to do more on this podcast. Anyway, eventually, I found an article that was talking about these issues, conspiracy theories in the deep state, particularly their history in modern American politics and how they function on both the left and the right. And I read it, I said, okay, and I tracked the author down, and he's at the University of Chicago, basically two buildings over. So I just walked down the hall and met him there. I could have saved myself a lot more time just by knocking on doors around the University of Chicago. But anyway, my guest today is Winston Berg, who is currently a postdoc at the University of Chicago, but will be joining the faculty at Harvard starting next year, if all goes well. Congrats on that job, Winston, and welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Yeah. It's perhaps the case that I haven't revealed my true power level to you yet, and you will get to some conspiracy theory that I'm going to advocate for later.
That's true.
We'll wait and see.
That's true. I only just met you last week, so I'm not entirely sure what can of worms I might be opening here. But at least on the basis of your article, and you wrote a dissertation on QAnon. Actually, why don't we start a little bit with that? I wanted to start with conspiracy theories, just in general, and we'll then move on to the topic of the deep state. So you wrote your dissertation on what is probably the most important or politically prominent conspiracy theories to affect American politics in recent times, and this is QAnon. Can you tell us a little bit about its narrative structure as a kind of narrative conspiracy theory, and what are its most salient features? So whom does it seek to implicate in wrongdoing, and does it have a kind of apocalyptic / sort of Christian template to it?
Right. So QAnon, to describe its narrative structure, it's going to sound sort of fairly boilerplate and simplistic for a conspiracy theory. But I think there's some interesting aspects of it that make it a bit different than previous conspiracy theories. So the sort of general narrative is basically just that there's massive government corruption by what Trump and other figures who are involved with this discourse call the deep state. But I think the key thing that makes this conspiracy theory different and more interesting to me personally is its focus on the media. So not only is there massive government corruption, but also it's being systematically obscured by mainstream media. And so this is where Q comes in. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Q is this figure, basically this pseudonymous account that started posting on an anonymous online web forum called 4chan right after Trump gets elected. And what this account starts posting are basically these sort of vague, cryptic messages, and asking people to decode these messages and saying, actually, the story you're getting in the media isn't the real story. It's being systematically obscured. I'm a leaker inside the Trump administration with top secret security clearance. And so I'm posting on this online anonymous forum, under conditions of basically plausible deniability, to put out a tendril to the public and sort of explain what is actually going on behind the scenes. And so the idea is that while it may look like, I mean, in first term, Trump isn't doing much of anything at all, in fact, there is this big war going on, and Trump and his allies are systematically eradicating these deep state figures. And in some cases, in some versions of the story, literally imprisoning people like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, such that like what's appearing in the media are basically like deep fakes of these people out in the public
Right.
and talking, and actually they're in Gitmo or they're in some other prison. And so I think the thing to focus on with QAnon is this sort of direct back and forth relationship between the public, the people that are interested in researching this theory, and this Q figure, this Q account that's supposed to be circumventing these informational blocks that stop people from understanding what's really going on.
Now that you describe it this way, it occurs to me that in the society that I study, I'm not, I don't think I've encountered the figure of a leak,
Mm.
right? Like someone on the inside who's leaking information to the public. Obviously, we're not just talking about gossip from the court,
Mhm, mhm.
but something, more systematic or about systems of governments. So that's just something I'm just going to put out there. This is a very particularly modern type of person. Um, you can probably find equivalents in the 17th century, maybe as early as that, something like that. Anyway, so what about the actual crimes that are being alleged? It, it, so my understanding of QAnon that there's this
Mhm.
massive sort of pedophilia conspiracy at
Right.
the heart of it, and to me it resonates a lot with traditional American satanic panics that I personally remember from the 80s when like heavy metal was targeted as
Mhm.
being satanic, and it had that whole kind of vibe to it. So is QAnon like largely recruiting among evangelicals who are seeing satanic influences?
Right. So this is a good question, and I'll start by I think answering a part of your previous question that I didn't sufficiently respond to, which is the extent to which this is sort of an apocalyptic narrative. Um, and on face, it basically is. So there's this sort of trope within the QAnon community, the Q community. They don't like being called QAnon. Um, that there's this event called the Storm, which is basically not necessarily the point where everybody is being arrested and all the corruption is being sort of rooted out. It's actually the point where the corruption is, where the success of Trump and his allies is being exposed or revealed to the public. So there's supposed to be this sort of apocalyptic or sort of revolutionary moment
Mm.
where Trump gets on camera and he says, "Folks, we got the deep state. We've already done this. Everything is already over. Everything's already been prepared for." So there is this sort of trope that I think is highly reminiscent of your sort of standard sort of Christianity tinged apocalyptic story. Um, at the same time, I think it's true that there is a sizable contingent of sort of evangelical folks in the QAnon community. I did my own survey on this where, so there's this QAnon streamer site, like web streamers making content very similar to what we're creating right now. It's called pilled.net. You can check it out, sort of red pilled is the origin of the title.
Okay.
Um, and so I basically watched several hundred hours of content from the top 100 streamers on the site
Oh
who were
man.
interested in QAnon. Um, and only about a quarter of them explicitly invoke Christian themes or imagery. Now, a quarter is still a lot,
Hmm.
so this is still a sizable contingent of the movement. Um, but there and there's other scholars who are working on QAnon who are more interested in the sort of evangelical connection. Mia Bloom is one of them. She has a pretty interesting book with Sofia Moskalenko on this called Pastels and Pedophiles, which is sort of about um, how women get involved in QAnon. Um, and so this idea that there's a connection between QAnon and evangelicals is sort of rooted in this view of conspiracy theories, which I think we could call rationalization theory, which is the idea that conspiracy theories are a way that you sort of protect or rationalize your existing beliefs when they're challenged by outside evidence. So perhaps I'm an evangelical, the world is changing in ways I'm not particularly satisfied with. And I don't understand why that's the case, or I don't like that my beliefs are being challenged. So I come up with this sort of eschatology that re-legitimizes my own beliefs to myself. Um, and so in this view, basically what's happening is conspiracy theorists are sort of trying to shut out outside influences or shut out outside information. Um, but that's not always what I found when I was interviewing QAnon people and when I look back at the genealogy of American conspiracy theories, even sort of satanic panic conspiracy theories. Granted, I was mostly looking at the 1950s here, not really the sort of
Hmm.
heavy metal oriented satanic panics of the 80s.
Yeah.
Um, but so what I found was that, yes, there's this sort of literal satanic element, um, but a lot of the sort of purchase that conspiracy theories get, and I think this is true for QAnon as well, actually comes from their capacity to sort of be highly capacious rather than constraining. And so, if I can give an example on this, so the John Birch Society was this sort of tip-top anti-communist group in the United States in the post-war mid-century period, basically ran by a guy named Robert Welch. Um, and so he starts off putting forward this sort of highly anti-communist conspiracy theory. Basically, the communists in Moscow are controlling all the world's governments directly. And there is a kind of Christian element here in that, like, the problem with communism is basically staged is that it's godless. You know, godless communism, this term is sort of an
Hmm.
epithet that comes up over and over again. But he runs into this issue where there's all these sort of anti-Semites who are joining his movement because they think that basically his anti-communist theory is sort of a dog whistle for his what they interpret as his like quote unquote actual anti-Semitic beliefs.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
and so in the article that you mentioned called "Origins of the Deep State Trope" that I put out in Critical Review last year, one of the arguments that I make there is that his shift, which I can talk more about later, away from this sort of anti-communist theory to a much more nebulous sort of deep state theory that he calls like the insiders theory, was motivated by a desire to put forward a theory that was amenable to both the anti-communists and the anti-Semites in his organization without sort of giving ground to either side. So
Okay.
the idea here that I try to put forward is that the conspiracy theories that last and that come out on top are ones that can absorb multiple competing interpretations at the same time. And so I think QAnon works in a very similar way, where there's a sort of eschatological evangelical take on QAnon, but it can coexist because of the way that the movement works with maybe a sort of smaller neo-Nazi contingent, which is not particularly Christian in the way that we would recognize them to be, or with people who are more informed by like worries about the CIA and don't really care that much about the kind of religious component to it.
Right. Right.
And so, like, while I think it's true that it is a satanic panic to a lot of people, I want to stress that I think the reason why it's been so successful is because it can be more than that as well.
Interesting. So I'm going to pick out one thing from what you said, which is that not only are the evildoers secret and hidden, but the entire war that's being waged between the good guys and the bad guys is also secret, and like
Right.
you wouldn't be able to see it in normal life or in the media, right? This is quite different from the narratives that I find in my sources. But what's
Mm,
interesting is that I find both parts of the story in my sources, right? So both the conspiracy theory that's satanic inflected and the apocalyptic narrative.
mm,
But I don't know of a case where they're actually combined, right? So let me just say something about the apocalyptic narratives that resonates with what you just said. We have a number of these kinds of apocalyptic stories, from from antiquity actually, but and throughout the Middle Ages, and it was a very versatile kind of literary fantasy medium in a
mm,
sense. I personally don't think it was ever really politically activated, like you actually see politicians or state agents acting on these things,
mm,
but they kind of proliferated as theological interpretations of what's coming. Definitely, cosmic struggles between the good guys and the bad guys, and it results in, a scenario that involves, the last emperor and a crown in Jerusalem or something like this. But they were very versatile. And the terms and the protagonists kept shifting, the geography kept shifting so that they could adapt to new constituents with, every century had its own, like it would be it could be the Romans could be the bad guy, or it could be the
mhm.
Muslims, or it could be like whatever, right?
So worries about the deep state and the sort of other kind of apocalyptic conspiratorial stories that show up in the QAnon community um, are basically just concerns that there are sort of hidden forces active behind the scenes that aren't legible to the public, often quite esoteric ones that can't be specifically reduced to, say, the communists or the Jews operating behind the scenes. Um, is there anything like that in the Byzantine world? Like worries that the empire or like the emperor is being controlled by some cabal of people who are don't have the public's best interest in mind?
Yes, absolutely. And I think they might very well be genealogically, you know, upstream from the ones that you're studying. And these are very real satanic conspiracy theories, and they have to do overwhelmingly with heretics.
Mm,
So periodically in the Middle Ages, you have these outbreaks of controversies about theological matters. And we don't need to get into here, how they start or their particular dynamics or whatever, but they result in sometimes pretty serious social polarization. Now, sometimes it's among small groups, but they happen to be the literate groups, so they produce these
mm,
theories. Sometimes they're pretty widespread socially. And the idea is that, so you're just going to have to follow me here. These are just assumptions that a lot of these people took for granted, that in order to be saved as a Christian, you have to have the right beliefs, that is, to believe precisely the correct theological doctrine. And because Satan wants you not to be saved, right? You join his team, as it were. He manipulates people into believing the wrong thing. This could be either through like paganism and antiquity, the worship of idols or whatever, but in Christian times it had to do with putting out these like wrong theological formulas. And so heretics were understood to be working for Satan, whether they knew it or
mm,
not.
mm,
And when the emperor, as often happened, sided with the wrong people, you very often had the production of these conspiracy theories about how the followers of Satan are lobbying with the emperor and the emperor secretly working with them, right? Because in our group, who are the true pious, believers who are a beleaguered minority and persecuted by the state or whoever, have to strike back against this. And this results in like pretty serious demonization of like your neighbors, your fellow citizens, whatever, and social polarization, such that it's sort of very difficult to talk to people once you've, put them in that box. But yeah, that's the narrative, and sometimes it's endorsed, at the highest levels. So that's I see these as satanic panics in a way that have to do with heretics and their infiltration of the court and the government and subversion of the proper, orthodox powers of the state. Yeah.
That's remarkably interesting because so this fellow Robert Welch that I mentioned previously, this sort of 1950s arch anti-communist conspiracy theorist, um, in this sort of struggle where he basically moves away from the anti-communist conspiracy theory to this sort of more nebulous deep state theory, where these faceless insiders are running things behind the scenes.
Mm,
Basically, the intervention that he makes in order to put forward this doctrine to his movement is by alleging that the sort of anti-communist and anti-Semitic theories were being put out there by the conspiracy itself in order to cover its tracks and divide his
right.
movement
False
against
flags.
itself. Right, right. And so basically what he argues in this pamphlet called The Neutralizers, and then again in 1906 in another pamphlet called More Stately Mansions, is that so before he had called this conspiracy a sort of conscious, dedicated communist conspiracy, but he switches his rhetoric. And he says, actually, the conspirators might not even realize that they are in the conspiracy, so to speak.
Right.
Sort of normal American liberals at the same time as maybe anti-Semites who are worried about Jewish control of the United States are probably both being manipulated by the insiders in order to generate social conflict. And they might not know it. It might just be one person in the organization who's tripping everybody up and putting forward these
Right.
wrong theories, basically. So I think there's an interesting resonance there with what you just said about this sort of concern about having the right beliefs and how having the right beliefs will save you. And so conspiracy theories are often about sort of triangulating from what other people believe, what you should believe. It's less about sort of factual evidence and more about sort of looking at what other people think is true about the world and then deciding what you think is true on the basis of whether or not you trust or don't trust them.
Actually, that's excellent because very often what in retrospect came to be identified as orthodoxy was reactive. In other words, you hear something from a, theologian or a preacher or whatever, and you think that's wrong and essentially evil, and you then formulate a response to that, which you think is orthodoxy, but you always present as having always been true,
Mm.
but actually you just kind of came up with it now. And yes, so here's another interesting difference. By the way, I don't know of any false flag operations. Well, no, no,
That's exact. You wouldn't know about it.
yes, they were very, very well done, so that we don't know. Actually, we do know about false flag operations, but though in like politics and war, I don't know of any accusations that something is
I
a
see.
false flag accusation. In other words, I don't think they had sort of theorized that as something that you call other people out on. Okay, so here's another key difference. The satanic panics in my world are try to not be to target anonymous kind of unknown
Mm.
secret agents, but to call them out by name.
Mm.
And so why? Because there's always a contest going on over owns the Christian label, like who's a true Christian. And your group is always the true Christian. And so you've got to label the other group something. And that's why we end up with these labels like Arianism and Nestorianism and Monophysitism and all iconoclast, because you have to brand them as something else, usually by calling out their leader and naming everybody else after him. So you don't want them to remain or to be sort of secret or hidden. Anyway, but as I said, this way of thinking and engaging with your adversaries is, I think, very zero sum and results
Mm.
in like serious social polarization. And
Right.
you found this in your research, right? Like you
Right.
study these effects too?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of a couple different perspectives basically on how stories like this, conspiracy narratives sort of link up with social polarization or engender social polarization. So like Anthony, imagine I tell you, I'm that well, Hillary Clinton is sort of harvesting people's blood or something like that, and using it to stay young forever. Like,
This is
what would you?
frazzle drip. I know this one.
Right.
Okay.
What would your reaction be to this statement?
What's your evidence?
Oh,
No,
okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
crazy.
Right. I think this is sort of like the point of entry for me, basically, is that like there's some people for whom if I make that statement, you'll think absolutely no way, not a chance. It
Yep.
doesn't even make any sense.
Right.
And there are some people who will say, well, we'll either find it plausible or we'll say, well, we at least have to look into this further and figure it out. There's a sort of difference in natural reaction,
Yes.
basically.
Yes.
And so the sort of issue then is basically like, how do we explain that difference in reaction? Like if there's this sort of polarized like one group of people that find such things plausible and another group of people that find it totally obviously implausible, a difference in our sense of what is obvious, then like
Right.
what's going on there? And so there's sort of like what I would call the current mainstream way of thinking about this in political science. We'd call maybe like a cognitive explanation. And
Okay.
so there's a wonderful book called Enchanted America from Eric Oliver, who's in our political science department here at U Chicago, and his co-author Thomas Wood at Ohio State. And they basically explain this difference in reaction through a difference in cognitive style. So there are some people who are just sort of naturally more oriented towards reason, basically, is the term they use. And then another set of people that are naturally more oriented towards intuition. If we want to be maybe a bit less charitable, you'd say magical thinking. That's a term that they use as well. And this is sort of the classic story about conspiracy theories in American politics, or the classic explanation of them. You've probably heard of Richard Hofstadter's paranoid style.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea in that article is that some people just have this sort of, well, paranoid style, that they're more stylistically receptive to arguments that are sort of sensationalist in this way. And that's a sort of pessimistic way, in my view, of looking at this difference, because it's just sort of who we are. I'm
Yeah,
either
doesn't
sort of
it
rationalistic or
doesn't it like
intuitionistic.
it sort of essentializes psychological states and attributes political polarization to just kind of innate psychology, right?
Right, to personal psychology, basically.
Yeah.
And so an alternative, like the sort of other mainstream explanation, the alternative to this cognitive explanation, is what we can call radicalization theory, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is sort of hugely popular in journalism.
Yeah.
Especially in articles about QAnon, which is the idea that maybe your son or your cousin or your dad encounters some article about QAnon or some YouTube video, and then by chance through a recommendation algorithm, and then is at least minimally receptive to it, and then continues to seek out further content in that vein, and thus becomes radicalized. Um, and although this is sort of scary, and like a lot of the American public is very scared of radicalization, I would argue that this is actually a somewhat more optimistic explanation for the uptake in conspiracy theories, because at least in this world, people are minimally receptive to new information, and thus could be, that contradicts with their existing beliefs, and thus could potentially be de-radicalized.
Right.
Um, so I think that these are two very popular explanations, but in my dissertation, in my own work, I kind of put forward a third one that tries to bridge the gap between these two explanations, for sort of polarized difference, which is an institutional explanation, basically.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so this is sort of how it links back to QAnon, because the interesting or unique thing about QAnon is how participatory it is, in that I can interact directly with Q, and I can sort of put forward my theory, which when Q was active, Q is no longer active, could literally respond to me and tell me if I was on the right track. And so if you look at their web communities, there's this back and forth between Q and the public. Now, when Q goes away after Biden wins in 2020, they have to fill this gap. So it's part of my dissertation project. I basically hung out with the people who were involved with what we would maybe call like a fact-checking exercise on these forums, but from the sort of QAnon perspective, where there were folks who were called bakers, which is a sort of convoluted pun that like forum thread sounds like bread. So the bakers are responsible for the breads, which
Okay.
is totally irrelevant to what we're talking about. But basically, I was hanging out with these bakers who were responsible for kind of adjudicating what posts should be allowed to remain on the forum and what posts should be removed. They're moderators, basically.
Right, right, right.
And so I think rather than sort of locating people's um, propensity to react differently to these statements in their personal psychology, or in the sort of content that they're consuming, I think it probably has a lot to do with the sort of institutional and social environment that they're using to validate the information that they encounter.
Okay. I mean, that might resonate with me. So the way you describe the initial polarity, I would want to say, oh, I'm on the side of like reason.
Who wouldn't
But
want to
of
say
course,
that?
but the thing is, I know that my reasoning process is based, even when I'm reading scholarship and science and whatever, I don't have an enormous amount of trust in
Right.
people who are actually doing the research, right? And that they have the data, they've done the work, right? In my own work, I happen to be sort of, in a sense, fortunate enough that I can actually quote my sources in like the notes so my readers can go see if the thing
Mhm.
says the thing that I say that it says. But I know that that's not the case in many disciplines, and that there's all of this trust. And so for me, the reason part of it is that for any conspiracy theory, like my initial reaction is how many people would have to be keeping this major, major, major
Right.
secret so amazingly effectively, right? That and I don't think that it can be a very large number. So when a theory presupposes that like millions of people and world leaders and doctors conspired over COVID, I just don't believe that. I think if you get more than four people, someone's going to start talking,
Right.
and then there will be evidence like leaking all over the place. So to that degree, I think that my reaction is that my intuition is kind of
Mhm.
reasonable in that, I just kind of have a baseline of how big a conspiracy can get, right? But anyway, so since we're talking about these kinds of large scale conspiracies or whatnot, let's talk about the deep state. So what is the deep state and where does this concept come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term itself, deep state, is a translation of a Turkish term that comes out of Turkish politics. I'm sure my Turkish pronunciation is terrible, but it's derin devlet in Turkish, deep state. And basically, this term starts being used in the aftermath of what people call the Susurluk incident, which was in 1996 in this town of Susurluk. There's a car crash.
Yes.
It's a terrible car crash. It gets run over by a truck. Um, when they're investigating this crash, they find a sort of unlikely combination of bodies of people who were injured or killed. There's the chief of or one of the chiefs of the Istanbul Police Department. There's a member of parliament in there. There's a leader of the Grey Wolves, which is a right-wing paramilitary group that's pretty active in Turkey. And then there's a mafioso, a contract killer, who later was found to also have worked for the Turkish National Intelligence Organization, the sort of Turkish version of the CIA. Um, and so the subsequent investigation basically revealed that all these different stakeholders were basically collaborating to organize against sort of leftist and Kurdish groups inside Turkey. Um, and so this is like this idea that there's a sort of synergy between organized crime, between elected officials, between police, between paramilitaries that goes above and beyond or outside the bounds of the formal political order. This is what's called the deep state in Turkey. And so this term later gets imported back into American politics by UC Berkeley academic Peter Dale Scott, who is also sort of done a lot of, up to this point, like interesting journalistic work, basically, uncovering similar connections between organized crime and intelligence agencies in the United States. And so in the 70s and 80s, he's using the term parapolitics and then deep politics to describe this phenomena. And then he encounters this term deep state and says, oh, of course, this is the term I was looking for. This sort of works very well with the phenomenon that I'm talking about. And in fact, the phenomenon that he's talking about is which I can go into if you like, is quite similar to the kind of synergies or collaborations that they found after the Susurluk incident in Turkey.
Yeah, well, um, before we get to that, and actually, I might be asking that question that you set me up for. Um, there are circumstances in which it's legitimate to talk about a deep state without being conspiratorial. Just because um, things, there are operations taking on, happening behind the scenes of any political structure that you don't always see, from the position of, Joe Public. Um, and when they're revealed, you're like, oh, whoa, there's a lot of gears in there. And I didn't know that they were all there. And, they slow things down or they speed things up and whatever. By the way, that term was picked up in Greece because
Hmm.
I remember that car crash very well. It was all over the Greek press. And in Greece, they, started talking about the deep state. In fact, I don't know, I almost, it might have been before that too. I don't remember right now. But for me, it was always a very kind of intuitive thing that there are just generally invisible forces in working in the bureaucracies of every state that they might not be sinister or doing anything particularly evil, but you don't see them, you don't know how they work. They explain the gap between like what people want and what they
Mhm.
get out of their political structures. Anyway, and so I remember sometimes I would just kind of drop the term in department meetings at Ohio State, and some of my colleagues would look at me like I was growing a second head on the side of it. Like, and I didn't know at the time that for them this was like super conspiracy terrain, and for me it was just kind of like, whatever. Um, so can you just mention a couple, just a few things from your experience that are, how should I put it, low stakes,
Right.
non-conspiracy oriented instances of deep state action?
Sure. And I'll start with the sort of, obvious academic caveat that it sort of depends on what you mean when you say deep state.
Of
And
course.
that it's a political term. It's not a sort of technical scholarly term. So people use it in these very strategic ways to sort of conflate perhaps more far-fetched things with some of these sort of, as you said, lower stakes examples of what we would maybe call informal politics or corruption.
Yeah.
So there's one of my favorite examples comes from Peter Dale Scott's journalistic work, which is basically about how the American intelligence agencies were attempted to basically fight the spread of communism in Southeast Asia in the sort of 70s. And so one of the sort of things that he digs up is basically the fact that the CIA and other American intelligence organizations will sort of how do you hide your actions both from the sort of American taxpayers who are concerned about your budget, and then also hide it from the communists in Burma or wherever. And the way you do that is you form private commercial organizations. So the CIA actually operated companies during this
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
The sort of famous ones are Civil Air Transport,
Air
which
America,
later,
wasn't it?
yeah, exactly. Civil
Yeah.
Air Transport becomes Air America.
Okay.
They changed the name, and so this was a commercial airline that was operated by the CIA, and then they would also use this to shuttle people and weapons to sort of anti-communist militants in Southeast Asia. And so, what makes this the deep state? Well, it's a state organization that is sort of operating a non-state sock puppet. Basically, there was
Yeah.
a similar there's a similar case here with Castle Bank, which was sort of Paul Helliwell. Are you familiar with this?
No.
So Paul Helliwell was a CIA slash OSS operative who, along with Meyer Lansky of the Jewish Mafia, basically invented offshore banking. They set up this bank in the Bahamas called Castle Bank, which was used to basically launder money for some of these more sort of covert CIA operations, and it also ended up being used by the Jewish Mafia as well.
Okay.
So it's another sort of sock puppet case there. And
Winston,
then
in your area of research, you can just say more interesting sentences
it's really lovely.
than, than I
It's the
can.
main attraction, you know. I get to learn all the fun sort of discursive terms. I get to talk about the Reds, which
And
nobody has
invent
said in
offshore
America.
banking. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And then so those are sort of very specific, sort of, I would say, small examples in comparison to what people mean these days when they say the deep state, which is something more like large scale corruption or something like the Iron Triangle, if you're familiar with this term, which is the idea basically that the same people are shuffling back and forth between business, Congress, and regulatory agencies.
Right.
And it's a sort of way of talking about regulatory capture, which is maybe slightly closer to what Trump is talking about when he says the deep state, when he's referring to this sort of permanent bureaucratic apparatus, which he believes has its own sort of distinct and solidified set of political interests that are different from those of the public.
Okay, so let's get to that. What sense does it make for him to try to dismantle that?
Um, so it only makes sense if you think that there is a sort of entrenched and solidified distinct interest of the bureaucracy, the quote unquote the bureaucracy, in comparison to the public. The sort of narrative, or like the sort of default, maybe we would say it, a liberal public narrative about the bureaucracy, is that these people are civil servants, they're nonpartisan by nature. They are sort of the exact opposite of what Trump thinks it is. But this is actually sort of a long-running argument in the conspiracy world, that the bureaucracy does have a kind of entrenched interest. So you can, and I do this in my research, sort of trace this back to concerns in the 1950s coming from people like James Burnham, who was a sort of conservative commentator involved with the National Review, about what they called the quote unquote professional managerial class. Have you heard this term?
I think so, but you seem to be using it in a technical sense. So
Right.
why don't you tell us what that is? Yeah.
Sure. So the Burnham's argument was more or less, um, and so he was also talking about large corporations, but it was also talking about the bureaucracy as well. It was basically that it's a sort of pseudo Marxist class, or it's reminiscent of a sort of Marxist class analysis, which is that highly educated professionals constitute a class in the same way that we might think of like the working class. And
Okay.
so we can imagine the working class has a set of interests.
Right.
Similarly, these PMCs, these professional managerial type people, also have a distinct interest.
Oh, is this the criticism being made of like the Democratic Party right now, that they're too tightly focused on appealing to that class?
Right, precisely.
Okay.
And so if you think about like what Trump is doing here, when he is in his efforts to dismantle the bureaucracy, um, he's one could argue that he's sort of, and especially with his attack on Harvard and stuff like this, like he's trying to target this specific class of people, which is with a class of people that's supposedly an object of resentment, by Trump's base, basically. Um, and so, like, a big part of his concern stems from his first term, where he experienced basically constantly being undermined, or at least thought he was being undermined or slow walked by his own appointees or by the bureaucracy when he was asking them to implement his agenda. Um, and so that's where he sort of gets this idea of the deep state, that we need to sort of take these people out and replace them with people who are more loyal, who don't sort of belong to this sort of fraught class of people with their own distinct interest. Um, and so, like, when we were preparing for this conversation, I thought to myself, doesn't this sound a bit like how medieval politics is portrayed in movies and books and stuff, like Grima Wormtongue and Lord of the Rings, you know? Whereas
Mm.
there's this idea that like the king doesn't actually have any power, or in Game of Thrones, there's this council working behind the scenes that actually is controlling everything, and the king or the emperor is just a figurehead. So, like, I know very little about medieval politics. Like, is this sort of an accurate trope to any extent? And sort of how accurate is this picture in the case of the Byzantine Empire?
So that situation that you describe is actually kind of common. Um,
Hmm.
Now, the powers behind the throne, as it were, couldn't necessarily hide that well. It's not like they were secret. Like everybody knew that this particular advisor is actually the person calling the shots. Sometimes the emperor might have been a child, okay, or just generally
Hmm.
an imbecile. Okay, this happens. Um, I'm more interested in cases of a more systemic clash rather than
Hmm.
just one of personalities where someone just might be, kind of exert a kind of personal influence over an emperor. That happens all the time. It could be his wife, it could be his uncle, it could be whatever, right? Or just some advisor, Grima Wormtongue, right? Or something like that. Um, so the more interesting cases are systemic, and I kind of made a mental short list in my mind about them because they're just take very different forms. So I'll give you one example.
Hmm.
The Emperor Julian in the fourth century. This is the last pagan emperor. right? He's young, he's sort of philosophical idealist. He comes to the throne to basically roll back most of the, what his own dynasty had done, like Constantine the Great, Christianization, all of this. Now, he doesn't actually do very much. I mean, he didn't reign for that long, but he actually leaves most of the government in place. But his whole brand is like ferreting out and like firing
Huh.
or punishing informants, like all spies, agents of the previous emperor, who was his cousin, against whom he had waged a war, in order to clean up this aura of terror, like this regime, this reign of
Mm.
terror, and where everyone's afraid of saying anything because there are informants everywhere, and just to throw all these people out of the palace. And he does that. I mean, we're not talking about that many people, but they had definitely created a sense among like the aristocracy and the people who have opinions and write them and so on, so sub-elites and
Mm.
secretarial staff and all of that, that they weren't safe and that he would sort of clean that up. So there's something like that. It's not entirely systemic. I'll give you a more serious version. And this is from the 11th century. And this is one of the rare cases where we have an author who I think is describing the deep state.
Mm. Mm.
And this is a person I've worked on a lot. His name is Michael Psedlos, 11th century courtier, philosopher, intellectual, and historian. And he wrote the history of this period. He knew all of these emperors. And at the end of his work, he's talking about the accession of one emperor. This is Isaakios Komnenos, who comes into power and he confronts this monster who Psellos says has 100 arms and 100 legs and like 100 mouths and is just eating. And this is a metaphor for the
Okay.
state and its functionaries. And he says it's just grown bloated and just fat and it's just constantly eating and reaching with all of its arms to just eat up everything. And that this emperor, who's like an anti-bureaucrat in this sense, right? He's trying to cut it down because it's too
Mm.
expensive and there's a deficit. There actually is a deficit. We can measure it because they're devaluing the currency. Like
Mm.
they can't, they don't have enough revenue to pay for this thing. So they're basically deficit spending, right? And he takes at it with like a sword and he's lopping off limbs and he's trying to cauterize the wounds. But we know roughly what kind of classes he's talking about because there had been a lot of like administrative bloat. And getting this monster to do what he wanted it to do was just very, very difficult. And so, now it's not linked to like conspiracy theory,
Mm.
right? It's not necessarily organized crime. It's just bloated government,
Mhm.
right? It's not necessarily that it's corrupt, though there are sort of ideas that a lot of these people are just not doing very much for the
Mm.
money that they're being paid. Yeah.
So how did this sort of class of administrators react? How did they respond to this attack?
Well, there's not much that they can do, but it's fascinating that basically what he implements is austerity.
Interesting.
Like there's only so much you can do. Um, and it's very unpopular. And somehow or other, he decides to retire. And it's very sketchy.
Interesting.
And this other one takes over who kind of rolls back the austerity, right? Um, and the previous emperor, Isakios, he retires to the monastery that he had grown up in as a child and just becomes the doorman.
So
Um,
is this the real story?
so honestly, I don't know. And it's super, super sketchy.
Hmm.
But he dies like 6 months later. He appears to have been, ill or something. But it's so rare for an emperor to be just talked out of off the throne. Anyway, um, okay, so that's one case. So let me tell you something else that might surprise you. So in the American Republic system that you're working with, the there's the apparatus of government and the executive is a sort of part of it, right? And
Right.
they're all supposed to be working together for the good of the American people, and other goals. Um, and these things have kind of grown up to have evolved together. So here's a funny thing about the Roman imperial state. In contrast to popular narratives like Star Wars, where the Republic is a good thing
Okay.
and the emperor who comes
Mhm.
along to, I don't know, abolish the Senate or whatever, whatever, is an evil emperor. He cackles and wears a cowl,
Mhm.
right? That's not really how things happened in Roman history. The late Republic, like the time around when Caesar was alive
Right.
and right, the civil wars, the transition to the empire, the aristocracy that governed the Republic was incredibly corrupt, plutocracy, and part of their collective interest was preventing the emergence of a state apparatus
Mm.
because that would limit their opportunities of
Mm.
action, basically exploiting the empire that they had created,
Mhm.
and including other Romans, right? And so they kept the apparatus of a state to a minimum.
Mm.
In fact, below the level where it could effectively
Mm.
govern this empire, which is why it wasn't really governed. The only you could only get a bureaucratic apparatus when you have the emperors because they create
Mm.
it in order to govern,
Mm.
because they're not so much concerned anymore about like equality among these 300 peer families. And so the administrative apparatus of the empire, of the Roman Empire, which actually does provide, you know, much better governance than under the Republic for the
Mhm.
vast majority of people. And it's an instrument of the imperial will, right?
Mhm.
So the tensions that you start to get between emperors and the bureaucracy, which are later, yeah, you do, right?
Mhm.
Like you have emperors who complain, no, they're never told anything, that
Mhm.
they're the last to find out what's going on, right? Um, here's a problem for emperors. How do you make sure that the bureaucracy doesn't replace not you, but like turn you into a figurehead,
Right.
right? And I'm sure that many American presidents do feel like figureheads. It's possible that Trump 2.0 thinks that Trump 1.0 was a kind of figurehead, right? And resents it,
Yes.
right? So how do you um, outflank the bureaucracy in order to do things that you want to do? That's, you know, well, I mentioned some examples earlier, but there's actually a wonderful book by Christopher Kelly called "Ruling the Later Roman Empire,"
Mhm.
which a large part of it is about that, like how emperors would create parallel systems of hierarchy
Mhm.
and reporting so that they could use one against the other, right? Or use eunuchs
Mhm.
from their like household and put them in charge
Mhm.
of institutions. Now, I'm not saying that these people in the Trump administration are eunuchs, but they're kind of functioning in the same way, right? You're
I
bringing
see.
in outsiders who are total loyalists because they don't have any options. Without you, they
Right.
would be
Right.
nobody. And you put them in charge of, like, I don't know, the FBI or whatever. And I find those to be very interesting parallels of kind of taming the deep state when you want to govern. Anyway, you have to create a lot of
Right.
confusion,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, he sort of brought back what in American politics was called the spoils system,
What's
which
that?
was basically the idea that, and this is sort of in the middle of the 19th century, that the president, when he assumes office, sort of owes these administrative and cabinet posts
Oh,
to his supporters,
I thought that was
basically.
mostly for ambassadorships.
Well, it was more than that as
Oh,
well.
okay.
There was also sort of kerfuffles over cabinet posts and things like that. And then there was a move away from that, and now there's a sort of this what you said about sort of eunuchs and how there's really not many other options besides sort of working for the household or for the emperor sort of resonates there with these sort of highly partisan arrangements where one can't really expect to be appointed or receive spoils outside of one sort of partisan allegiance, and
Got
so
it.
that becomes much more important.
Yeah, yeah. No, they would put eunuchs in charge of armies sometimes. So one army would be commanded by a eunuch from your household staff and another one from like the professional military
Mm.
hierarchy. And the surprising thing is that these eunuchs were often extraordinarily capable. Um, and anyway, that's just a peculiar feature of Byzantine military
Mhm.
history. Um, anyway, we don't have much time,
Mm.
but I wanted you to tell us a little bit about different right-wing versus left-wing theories of or notions of the deep state, because I think it's an important fact to bring out.
Yeah, sure. So, on one level, the difference is largely in terms of what parts of the state apparatus are being subjected to suspicion, basically. So I've mentioned this sort of mid-century left-wing sort of version of the deep state theory. There's a lot of suspicion around the intelligence agencies, around the so-called military-industrial complex, basically the military itself, plus these large corporations like Boeing that sort of spring up
Hmm.
and become dependent on government contracts, basically. Um, Versus this sort of right wing suspicion of what we would call the administrative state, the sort of cabinet or bureaucratic apparatus, as well as a lot of a ton of suspicion of these New Deal agencies. Um,
Right.
so that's sort of how it starts with just sort of a difference in targeting. But the structure of these concerns, the idea that there's basically capture there, and that these sort of informal or newer arms of the government grow to become much more powerful or permanent than your sort of classic three branches. Um, it sort of is obviously similar, and it's not just obviously similar to us as academics studying it, it was obviously similar to the activists in this period as well. So one of the things I talk about in this paper on the origins of the deep state trope were efforts, sort of cross-partisan efforts to organize to the left or organize to the right, sort of organizing the other side on the basis of these affinities between the sort of analysis that you're putting forward. So
Hmm.
there's one case that I find really interesting, I mean, do you know Students for a Democratic Society, SDS?
I've
So
heard
this
of
is
it, but right now I can't remember what they're for or against.
right. Well, they were basically the sort of new left student movement that springs up around the Vietnam War, basically, and
Oh,
they're sort
yes,
of
yes, yes.
right. And so like one of the things that I sort of talk about in the paper is their sort of flirtation with an ultimate embrace of conspiracy theories, specifically those seeking to explain the Kennedy assassination in 1963. Um, and so there's this fellow named Carl Oglesby, who was the first president of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. And he sort of buddies with lots of these libertarian thinkers. He reads Murray Rothbard, and he gets the idea that these guys, these sort of libertarians on the right who are with the Republican Party, are also anti-war. They also want out of Vietnam, and they also want to figure out who killed Kennedy. Um, so he gets this idea that he wants to organize them and sort of get them in the same movement. And so the way that he does this is through sort of making overtures to right-wing conspiracy theorists who were trying to explain the Kennedy assassination. And his analysis is basically like, look, we've been looking at the CIA and the military-industrial complex, and you guys have been looking at sort of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, these sort of oligarchic NGOs. Um, what if we're actually looking at the same thing from two different angles? What if there's sort of two different conspiracies? He calls them the Yankee conspiracy and the cowboy conspiracy. Um, and that actually we should just team up and then we can sort of figure this out together. And so this is tactically promising, not just because there's sort of affinities in the analysis, this sort of power structure analysis where there's a handful of movers and shakers behind the scenes that we have to identify, but also because it sort of tactically converts ideological or partisan questions into factual ones. So, I mean, if you're on the left and I'm on the right, we both see that Kennedy got killed, and we're both not particularly happy about it.
Right,
Um, if we figure out who killed Kennedy,
right.
well, if it's the communists, then I guess the right wing was correct, and if it was the oligarchs, well, then I guess the left wing was correct. So
Right.
we can figure out for sure which one of us is right in the future once we've solved this conspiracy and
Right.
answered the question of who killed Kennedy. But up until then, we may as well work together in order to figure out which one of us is
Interesting.
correct.
All right, Winston. We're coming to the end of the conversation. Obviously, there's so much more that we could talk about, and maybe in a later occasion we will. But I wanted to raise one more issue, which is that of uh, the deep state as a kind of set of personal connections. And I ask this because, previously we were talking about, at least on like my end, the kind of tension between the emperor and a kind of impersonal bureaucracy that
Mm,
may sometimes be difficult to wield. But we sometimes have the opposite situation where the emperor's like personal connections with relatives and so on are beginning to take over key parts of the state, and other people are worrying that like this like it's infiltrating that like the
right.
family is supplanting the impersonal institutions, and it's kind of this anyway. I was wondering if in your sort of mapping out of the terrain of the deep state, where do these kinds of things fall out in like modern politics, like the personal connection kind of corruption?
Sure. So the first thing that comes to mind to me as an Americanist, who mostly knows about American cases, are, I guess, what we would call political dynasties or political machines. So these are often examples that come from local or city politics, or in some case, state politics, which makes me think a little bit of our earlier remarks about to what extent it's even possible to sort of have a large scale deep state that everybody is still able to keep secret or keep operating outside of the public eye. But maybe that's a bit easier in terms of city politics. So the first example, or state politics as well, like the first examples that come to mind are Huey Long and the Long dynasty in Louisiana. So Long was the governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, and he basically runs the entire state by himself. He's sort of Trump-like in some of his mannerisms. Like when he is elected governor, he fires half the bureaucracy, replaces it with people that are personally loyal to him.
Right.
And there are still Longs kicking around in Louisiana to this day. There are Longs who are state senators, who are still involved in city politics. So this is a long running political dynasty in Louisiana. And then an example that might be familiar to you already, just from walking around our beautiful city of Chicago, and going into bars and seeing his face on things like clocks, even because he's such a part of our city, is the Daley dynasty. So there was Richard J. Daley in 1955 to 1976, and then his son, Richard M. Daley, in 89 to 2011. And the Daleys have lots of fun examples of self-dealing, basically. So the sort of famous one, perhaps you've heard of this, was the hired truck program, which was in 1996 to 2004. Have you heard of this?
No.
So the deep state of Chicago is basically municipal like ensconced in municipal contracts for garbage collection. The
Okay.
uh, the hired truck program was this sort of fraudulent, very mobbed up program that was managed by John, or in part managed by John Daley, who's the brother of the younger Daley, Richard M. Daley. And so John Daley was responsible basically for selling insurance to these private truck companies that were hired by the city to collect municipal waste. And basically, journalists started following these trucks around and realizing that they were just sitting there, not doing anything. And so this led to this whole moment in like 2004, 2005, where journalists are figuring out that this hired truck program is basically just a mechanism for self-dealing. So
Right.
the city would like gave 40 million in contracts to these private truck companies, which would then continue to pay like people like Rod Blagojevich, who was the governor at the time,
Mm.
Michael Madigan, the Secretary of State. Your sort of classic Chicago style politics characters, and they were using this sort of municipal mechanism to move money around. And the Dailies were very involved with that. Um, but I think in both of those cases, there's this. I think they raise this question of when we ought to call something an example of a deep state versus something like corruption or authoritarianism. Like in the Huey Long case in the Long family, he was very overt about what he was doing. He would give interviews where he would say, "I'm the Constitution in Louisiana," or he would run around the House of Representatives like personally asking for bills to get passed and stuff like that. So it was very open. It wasn't really deep. It was sort of surface level. Uh, and then the dailies, there's all these familial networks behind the scenes, but it's still pretty public facing. Like the dailies are like he was the mayor. So he's
Right.
he's
Right.
leveraging personal connections, but it's still sort of overt formal politics. So there's I think one more interesting case from American city politics that I think maybe falls a bit closer to what we mean when we say deep state versus something like authoritarianism, which is this super famous case of Robert Moses, who was basically involved in building New York City in the 1920s and 1930s. And what's interesting about this case, yes, there's sort of patronage networks involved, but I think it's a much more clear-cut case of, shall we say, less formal institutions or less sort of strictly governmental institutions forming and then usurping a lot of the power that was previously held only by the city government. So this is in 1931, Robert Moses basically gets picked to run this tri-borough tri-borough bridge and tunnel authority. And he authors the act for this public, to create this public authority, this sort of municipal corporation in New York City. And does it in such a way that basically ensures that it can continually issue bonds forever, thus allowing him to have his own financial base to make changes to the city, and then authors the act in such a way that like the authority has, well, authority over anything that sort of touches the roads in the city. Right. And so in doing so, and then he gets his own police force, which are the bridge and tunnel officers.
Yes.
So it's a much more clear-cut example of someone with a sort of personal network finding their way into a position that then is able to absorb a lot of the powers that would conventionally be held by the city government. Right. So that's the sort of famous case from Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker. Yeah. So I think maybe that's a bit closer to what we mean when we say deep state. But in all of these cases, and you can even think about other political dynasties like the La Follettes in Wisconsin, also from the mid-century. Why are all these, deep states or pseudo deep states able to persist or able to be successful? Well, they actually do quite a lot for the public. So Huey Long was an overt authoritarian, but he massively increased infrastructure investment in the state of Louisiana. It was the state with the least infrastructure, and by the time he's done with it, it has 6 times the amount of highways, like 3 times the amount of roads. In New York City, Moses is doing something very similar. He's creating all these super useful and important bridges that allow people to get around the different boroughs of the city. The deep state gets stuff done in these cases. And so I think this is sort of relevant for our contemporary concerns about Trump's war against the deep state or the so-called deep state. Because even though Trump is himself accused of being anti-democratic, his critique of what he thinks of as the deep state is basically grounded in an appeal to democratic legitimacy, in that he's basically arguing that the bureaucracy and the administrative state is not sufficiently accountable or responsive to the electorate. It would maybe be harder to make that kind of critique of Robert Moses's deep state because he's actually doing things that people want him to do. He's doing a lot of things that people don't want him to do as well, but he's doing enough that people are sort of okay with it. And so Trump's argument is basically the administrative state isn't doing enough for us, so we need to hold them accountable. And so this makes me wonder about the Byzantine case. It's a bureaucratic society or a bureaucratic government, but it's not a democratic one. Right. So if you were going to critique the Byzantine bureaucracy, you probably wouldn't reach for these democratic norms that we reach for. So what would people reach for in the Byzantine Empire to leverage critiques of the government?
It's so interesting that you would bring it around to that. As it happens, I'm engaged, as many of us are, in conversations with friends and colleagues about like the current situation that we're in and what is the best way to either critique or resist this attack on government, and to what degree is there a point to doing so? And my friends are in like law firms or academia, also the corporate world, and there are split opinions. So one is that violations of principle have to be resisted, and another is that those just won't fly electorally. In other words, that the population at large doesn't care so much about violations of principle, let's say like due process or something like that, but are rather more results oriented. So inflation, the economy, these kinds of things, right. Job opportunities. And that unless you can make an argument based on that, you're not going to have a very successful one if it comes down to elections. And so it's interesting that you should point out that, yes, this is not a democratic society to begin with. Nevertheless, ultimately, emperors are accountable to public opinion. Well, so there's a very complicated, I mean, maybe it's not that complicated, but in Constantinople, there is no right to the throne.
Mm,
So, like, once crowned, that doesn't mean that you get X number of years or anything. You're
mm,
like constantly on probation. And out of the 91 or so emperors who go through Constantinople, something like 46 of them are deposed or removed or killed like by force. So that's a pretty high number. So they're always like very watchful for shifts in public opinion. And our texts are constantly talking about public opinion. If you ever read a modern theorist who says that's a modern thing, don't believe
I
them.
see.
Public opinion in Constantinople was hugely important. People could come out in very, very large numbers, and usually when that happens, the regime is over because rivals will take advantage of that to depose you, and there won't be resistance from the people of Constantinople and in other cities as well. So ultimately, it came down to whether people generally thought you were doing a good job
Mm,
based on what you were delivering. And so we do have cases where emperors are critiqued for doing exactly the kinds of things that you were talking about, adjusted for medieval
sure.
realities, basically putting their relatives in all of these key places, like having their fingers in every pie, and just kind of, raking in revenues from all kinds of, places where the state interfaces with the
Mm,
rest of the economy. But if they didn't become unpopular for failing to deliver, they weren't really in any kind of jeopardy, right? So, if the food prices go up, that was huge. If food prices go
mm,
up, the regime instantly becomes unpopular. If they're losing foreign wars, so security in the countryside, because, a lot of especially the sort of grandees in Constantinople, right? So they're drawing their revenues from properties that they have in the countryside. So if they're losing those,
mm,
that's a major problem. And so in the end, it this example supports those of my friends who believe that ultimately the argument has to be one of like actual living conditions that people are experiencing and not those of principle. Not that principles don't matter, right? But that electorally, in terms of actual political facts, it's going to have to be something like that. Yeah. And so those critiques of like emperors for violating like the public-private distinctions,
mm.
right? For turning the state into a family business, they're very interesting, but like they kind of reflect an intellectual class that was sort of more invested in
I
those
see.
principles. And they don't seem to pan out in like mass action until the wheels start coming off, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, ultimately it's like whether you can deliver what people want, which seems to jibe with what you're saying.
Right, right. I mean, I think that's sort of the key difference between institutions like this that survive in the cases that I'm talking about and in the cases that you're talking about as well. I think if you have time for one more question on
Sure.
this, just you mentioned that there's sort of these different constituencies, perhaps sort of elites that are more responsive to these like principle based arguments, and then the public is perhaps more responsive to concerns about the like cost of living, sort of everyday material realities.
Yeah.
Um, and so how does it happen sort of that one like I guess under what conditions does the government start to care about those different like one constituency versus the other?
Ah, yes. Well, I've sort of written a book on that. Um, so emperors are monitoring prices.
Mm,
Emperors are also monitoring public opinion in many ways, but primarily in the hippodrome. So the
mm,
hippodrome it's this massive sports arena right next to the palace. And there are games many, many, many days a year, and emperors have a special passageway where they go from the palace to the box, which is an extension of the palace into the hippodrome. Think Ben-Hur, like the chariot
right.
racing, right? That sort of thing. If the people are cheering wildly and acclaiming the emperor, it's like, okay, yeah, whatever. But if they're like the mood is sullen or they're grumpy, or very often booing,
Huh.
and sometimes there'll be like organized chants. Well, they'll be saying something like the city prefect is a crook, meaning like They're not arranging for the prices of the, food to, right? The emperor then is like, oh boy, got to
That's
do something
awesome.
about this. But they're getting reports about these things. Yeah, anyway, we can have a separate discussion about like information, and how do they know things. Another way is court cases.
Mm.
Because emperors get appeals all the time. And from those appeals, it could be like hundreds a day. They're getting a sense of what problems are in the provinces. And I think that's a key mechanism for them to get their, have their finger on the pulse of like what's going wrong, are the kinds of court cases that they're being asked to appeal to, look at again. Anyway, great. Winston, this has truly been a pleasure. I'm glad I found you. Like I said, uh, I could have just gone knocking on the halls. Just to, do you work on the deep state? Do you work on the deep state? And someone would say, oh, no, that's Winston down in.
Oh, maybe you
Anyway,
would have been black bagged for digging too deep at that point. So it's good that you reached out by email.
yeah, it was fun. And, maybe we can think of another topic on which we can
Absolutely.
exchange notes about modern and medieval societies. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Cheers.